Hey everyone, welcome to our channel. We're just getting started here, and if you're enjoying the spooky content, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us create more videos like this, and after you've watched, let us know what you think down in the comments. Let's dive into the horror. Simon Graves had one simple rule in life: stay far away from small, isolated towns. But when he received a call from his estranged brother, Ethan, who sounded frantic and desperate, Simon found himself driving to a place called Hollow Hill. Ethan had left Simon a voicemail at 3 in the morning, his voice low and panicked, urging Simon to come quickly. "It's all wrong here, Simon. I need you to see for yourself." Simon hadn't seen Ethan in over 5 years. His brother had always been the adventurous one, wandering from place to place, often disappearing for weeks at a time. This time, though, something about his voice had left Simon unsettled, so he reluctantly drove the winding road that led to Hollow Hill. As he approached the town, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the road and surrounding forest. The eerie silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of branches, as if something unseen were watching him from the shadows. The hairs on his neck stood up, and he tried to shake off the unease. He arrived at the old inn where Ethan had said he was staying. It was a dark, weathered building, nestled deep in the woods at the edge of town. When Simon stepped inside, he was greeted by an empty lobby and a musty scent that hung heavily in the air. He called for Ethan, but only silence answered. As he wandered through the halls of the creaky inn, Simon's nerves frayed further with each empty room he passed. Just as he was about to give up, he heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the room at the end of the hallway. Gathering his courage, he knocked on the door and stepped inside. Ethan was sitting on the floor, back against the wall, his eyes wide and unfocused. He looked gaunt, as if he hadn't slept in days. His hands shook as he gestured for Simon to sit. "Simon, I found it," Ethan whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "The hill. It calls to me." Over the next few hours, Ethan spoke in fragmented, feverish sentences. He had come to Hollow Hill in search of a hidden place he'd read about in an old book, something called the Mouth of Echoes. It was rumored to be hidden deep within Hollow Hill, a place where the past and future merged, and where voices from beyond could be heard. "I know it sounds mad," Ethan said, gripping Simon's arm, "but I swear, Simon, I heard them. Voices. They called my name. They told me things about myself, things only I know." Simon shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. "Ethan, you need rest. This place, it's getting to you." But Ethan was insistent, his eyes burning with a manic intensity. "You don't understand. I can't leave, Simon. They know me now. They've seen me." Despite his misgivings, Simon agreed to accompany Ethan up the hill the next day. Maybe if he saw the place for himself, he could convince Ethan to leave this strange town and come back to the city. The next morning, Simon and Ethan set out for Hollow Hill. The fog clung to the trees, thickening as they climbed, and the forest around them grew unnaturally silent. No birds sang, no branches snapped, just the steady crunch of their footsteps on damp earth. At the top of the hill, they found a clearing. In the center, a stone well stood, covered in moss and surrounded by strange carvings. The air grew colder, and Simon felt an inexplicable sense of dread settle over him. Ethan approached the well, placing his hands on the edge and leaning over to peer inside. "Ethan, be careful," Simon warned, but his brother was already staring down into the darkness. "There," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling with awe. "Can you hear them?" Simon leaned in reluctantly, listening. At first, there was nothing but silence, but then a faint whisper drifted up from the depths, echoing in the hollow of the well. The voice was soft, distorted, as if it were calling from miles away. It said his name. "Simon." The voice stretched, winding up from the darkness in a raspy murmur. It was familiar, yet not. A twisted version of his own voice. Simon pulled back, his heart racing. This is some kind of trick, Ethan. We have to leave. But Ethan was entranced, leaning closer, his face just inches from the mouth of the well. They're calling us, Simon. They want to show us what's hidden. Suddenly, a gust of cold air rushed out of the well, carrying with it a cacophony of voices, each one louder and more frenzied than the last. They surrounded Simon and Ethan, filling the clearing with a bone-chilling chorus of whispers, screams, and laughter. "Ethan!" Simon shouted, grabbing his brother and pulling him away from the well. But as they stumbled back, Ethan's face went pale. His mouth moved soundlessly, his eyes wide with terror as he clutched Simon's arm. "They're inside," he whispered, his voice shaking. "They're in my head." As they made their way down the hill, Ethan's condition worsened. He muttered to himself, his eyes darting around as if he were seeing things that Simon couldn't. At one point, he stopped and turned to Simon, his face a mask of horror. "They're coming for us, Simon. We shouldn't have listened. Now they know where we are." Desperate to help his brother, Simon quickened their pace, dragging Ethan back toward the inn. But as they neared the edge of the forest, Ethan collapsed, clutching his head and screaming. "They're here!" he cried. "They're here!" Simon looked around, but there was no one, just the empty woods and the distant whisper of the wind. But then he heard it. Faint, like the rustling of leaves, a voice drifted through the trees calling his name. It was Ethan's voice, and then his own, and then the voice of a stranger, each one overlapping in a haunting melody. They stumbled into the inn, locking the door behind them. But the voices didn't stop. They seemed to seep through the walls, surrounding them, closing in. Ethan curled up in a corner, rocking back and forth, whispering to himself. Simon tried to comfort him, but he could feel the voices creeping into his mind, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. As the night wore on, the voices grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to chant in unison, calling for them to return to the hill. "Ethan," Simon whispered, barely able to keep his voice steady. "We have to leave, now." But Ethan just shook his head, his eyes hollow and distant. "They won't let us go, Simon. We're part of them now, part of the echoes." With a sinking feeling, Simon realized his brother was right. There was no escaping Hollow Hill. The voices had marked them, claimed them, and now they were lost. In the early hours of the morning, Simon took one last look at his brother, whose face was pale and lifeless. He could still hear the voices, faint but insistent, calling him back to the hill. Weeks later, a pair of hikers found the inn abandoned, its rooms empty and untouched. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the two brothers who had come and disappeared, leaving only whispers in the wind as proof of their presence. But those who ventured near Hollow Hill swore they could hear voices drifting through the fog. If they listened closely, they might hear two voices, intertwined and echoing through the trees, calling out in an endless chorus. Two brothers, lost to the hill, forever part of the haunting echoes of Hollow Hill. Elena had always been a bit of a dreamer. She spent her early 20s moving from one art job to another, trying to find a place where her creativity could flourish. When she landed an apprenticeship with an established artist, a man named Victor Lethbridge, it felt like her lucky break. Victor was known in the art world for his unique, haunting portraits, and the idea of working under him felt surreal. Victor's home and studio were nestled in a secluded forest, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. He insisted that his apprentices live on site, claiming that isolation helped with concentration. Though hesitant at first, Elena accepted the arrangement, eager to learn from a master. When she arrived, Victor greeted her warmly. He was tall and thin, with piercing blue eyes and hands that looked as if they were carved from stone. Despite his success, Victor was surprisingly humble, his personality almost gentle. But as she explored his home, Elena couldn't shake a strange feeling. The house was filled with paintings, each one more disturbing than the last. Portraits of people with hollow eyes, twisted expressions, and features that seemed just a bit wrong. "Welcome, Elena," Victor said, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "I trust that you'll find this place inspiring." Elena smiled and nodded, hiding her discomfort. She told herself that it was only nerves. After all, she was finally where she'd always wanted to be. The days at Victor's estate quickly fell into a pattern. Every morning, Elena would work on her sketches and experiments, and in the evenings, she would assist Victor with his own pieces. But something was off. Victor would paint only at night, always locking himself in his studio until sunrise. During these midnight sessions, Elena would hear strange sounds, the scraping of a brush on canvas, muttering, and sometimes what sounded like crying. One night, as Elena was heading to her room, she found herself lingering outside Victor's studio door. The light from within was dim, casting long shadows under the door. She could hear Victor murmuring, his voice soft and rhythmic, almost like a chant. Curiosity got the best of her, and she pressed her ear to the door. "Stay still," he whispered. Almost perfect." A chill ran down her spine. She stepped back, her heart pounding, but she quickly dismissed the feeling. Artists could be eccentric, she told herself. Who was she to judge his methods? The next morning, Victor's latest painting was on display in the hallway. It was a portrait of a young woman, but something about it felt alive. The eyes seemed to follow Elena as she moved, and the expression on the woman's face was one of sheer terror. "Beautiful, isn't she?" Victor's voice startled her. Yes, Elena stammered, forcing herself to look away. "It's very realistic." Victor's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Thank you, Elena. I capture emotions, you see. That's what makes my work unique." Elena forced a smile, but a knot of fear was beginning to grow in her stomach. She was starting to realize that Victor's work wasn't just realistic, it was unsettling, as if he were painting souls trapped within the canvas. Over the following weeks, Elena began noticing other oddities around the house. Sometimes she'd see shadows moving in the corner of her eye, even when she was alone. There were whispers too, faint and unintelligible, as if the walls themselves were murmuring secrets. One night, she found herself wandering through the dim hallways, drawn by some inexplicable force. She paused in front of a door she'd never noticed before, hidden at the end of a narrow corridor. Slowly, she turned the handle and stepped inside. It was a small storage room filled with covered canvases. Dust floated in the air, and the room smelled faintly of paint and something else, something metallic. One by one, she uncovered the paintings. Each one was a portrait, more horrifying than the last. People's faces twisted in agony, their eyes wide with despair, their hands reaching out as if begging for help. Her heart raced as she recognized some of the faces. They were former apprentices of Victor's, young artists who had once come to learn under him, just like she had. She backed out of the room, her mind reeling. What was he doing to them? And why did they all look so trapped? As she stumbled into the hallway, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She turned, her eyes widening in terror as she came face to face with Victor. "Curiosity can be dangerous, Elena," he murmured, his voice soft yet menacing. "Some things are best left unseen." Elena managed to stammer out an apology and hurried back to her room, locking the door behind her. She barely slept that night, haunted by the images of those tortured faces. Elena knew she had to leave. She'd been ignoring the warning signs for too long, but now she was certain. Something sinister was happening in Victor's house, and she was next. She planned to escape at dawn, when Victor would be asleep after his midnight painting session. But as midnight approached, she heard a soft knock on her door. Heart pounding, she opened it to find Victor standing there, a canvas in his hands. "I need you to pose for me, Elena," he said, his voice low and calm. "This will be my masterpiece." She tried to refuse, but his gaze was intense, hypnotic, and she found herself unable to speak. He led her into his studio and positioned her in front of a large blank canvas. "Stay very still," he instructed, lifting his brush. As he began to paint, she felt an odd sensation, as if her body were growing heavy. Her limbs refused to move, and her voice was trapped in her throat. She watched in horror as her reflection in the canvas grew more vivid, her own face staring back at her, eyes wide with fear. "Victor," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. "Please, stop." He didn't respond, his hand moving faster, his eyes gleaming with manic intensity. With each stroke of his brush, she felt herself growing weaker, as if her very life were being pulled into the painting. As the final strokes were added, she felt her spirit tearing away from her body. Her last sight was Victor's smile, his eyes filled with satisfaction, as if he had captured something priceless. The next morning, visitors to Victor's gallery would notice a new painting hanging in the hallway. It was a portrait of a young woman, her face pale and frightened, her eyes hollow and pleading. The portrait was breathtaking in its realism, and people would stop to admire the detail, marveling at the way her expression seemed to reach out, almost as if she were alive. Victor would simply smile, standing proudly beside his latest masterpiece. And if anyone listened closely, they might hear a faint whisper coming from the painting, a voice calling out, begging for release. But it would be drowned out by the murmurs of admiration from the crowd, who would walk away, blissfully unaware of the soul trapped within the canvas. In the years that followed, Victor continued to take on new apprentices, each one lured by the promise of fame and skill. And with each new arrival, his collection of haunted portraits grew, the faces of lost artists forever captured, forever crying out in silence. One day, a young man, another hopeful artist, would notice Elena's portrait and feel an inexplicable shiver down his spine. He'd brush it off, just as she once had, never realizing that he was looking at his own fate, locked forever within the eyes of the Midnight Painter's final masterpiece. When Emily and her friends arrived at Blackwood Cabin, they were looking forward to a relaxing weekend in the woods. The cabin was nestled deep within the forest, miles away from the nearest town, just as they'd planned. It was old but well-maintained, with a rustic charm that made it the perfect retreat. Emily had rented it on a whim, seeing the photos online and thinking it looked too good to pass up. The group consisted of Emily, her boyfriend Mark, her best friend Sarah, and Sarah's fiancé Tom. The drive had been long, and they were eager to unpack and start the weekend. However, as they stepped inside, they all felt a slight chill in the air, and the cabin felt darker than it had looked in the photos. But they brushed it off as just a consequence of being in an old building. After dinner, they settled in the cozy living room with a fire crackling in the hearth. Emily noticed an old faded painting above the fireplace, depicting a man with sunken eyes, staring blankly into the room. His expression was vacant, and it seemed like his eyes followed her wherever she went. "That painting is creepy," she whispered to Mark, who nodded in agreement. But they laughed it off, chalking it up to the eerie ambiance of the cabin. As the night wore on, they retired to their rooms, ready for a peaceful sleep. Around midnight, Emily was jolted awake by a faint whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she lay still, she could clearly hear it. A soft, indistinct voice murmuring somewhere close by. It sounded like it was just outside their bedroom door, whispering unintelligible words. She nudged Mark awake, but as soon as he opened his eyes, the whispering stopped. They brushed it off, assuming it was just the old cabin creaking, or perhaps some forest animal outside. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and the silence that followed felt unnatural. The next morning, over breakfast, Sarah mentioned hearing whispers too. Tom laughed it off, teasing her about her vivid imagination, but when Emily admitted she'd heard the same thing, Everyone grew quiet. They decided not to let it ruin their day and went on a hike, exploring the dense forest surrounding the cabin. But Emily felt uneasy, like something was always lurking just out of sight, hidden among the trees. That evening, as they sat around the fire again, the strange feeling returned. The room seemed colder, and they all felt an inexplicable heaviness in the air. Sarah broke the silence by asking, "Did any of you notice that figure on the hill when we were hiking?" Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What figure?" Sarah described seeing a tall, dark figure standing at the top of a hill, motionless and watching them as they passed below. "I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light," she added, her voice shaky. No one had seen it but her, but Emily felt a growing sense of dread. They tried to laugh it off, but everyone could feel the tension rising. As the fire dimmed, they decided to head to bed, hoping sleep would bring some relief. Emily was awakened again that night, this time by a scratching sound at the door. It was slow, deliberate, like fingernails scraping against the wood. She nudged Mark awake, and together they listened in silence, hearts pounding. The scratching continued, then stopped, replaced by soft footsteps, moving slowly down the hall. When the door creaked open slightly, they both froze, barely breathing. A shadowy figure stood just outside their door, its outline faintly visible in the dim moonlight. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized it was the same figure from the painting above the fireplace, the man with the vacant, hollow eyes. The figure lingered for a moment before disappearing down the hall. Emily and Mark stayed awake the rest of the night, their nerves frayed, hoping it was all just a nightmare. The next morning, they decided to pack up and leave, but as they were loading the car, Tom suddenly went pale and clutched his chest, his face twisted in pain. "It's here," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. They helped him inside, thinking it was just exhaustion or dehydration. But Tom insisted he'd felt something cold wrap around his chest, squeezing the life out of him. Emily glanced around the cabin, her eyes drawn to the painting once more. The man in the painting now seemed to be smiling, his hollow eyes glinting with malice. Panicked, Emily tore the painting from the wall, and behind it, they discovered a message scratched into the wood. "You are not alone. You will never leave." They were horrified, but there was no time to process it. Tom's condition worsened, and they knew they had to get him to a hospital. As they hurried to the car, the whispers began again, growing louder and more frenzied. As they drove away, the fog thickened, and no matter how far they drove, the cabin seemed to loom in the rearview mirror, as if it were following them. Tom, barely conscious in the back seat, began muttering in a low, raspy voice, words that were not his own. "He's here. In me. He wants out," he whispered, his voice trembling. The road twisted and turned, and the fog grew denser, obscuring everything but the faint outline of the cabin behind them. It was as if they were trapped in an endless loop, unable to escape. Finally, they emerged from the fog, and Tom fell silent. They looked back one last time, and the cabin was gone. They breathed a sigh of relief, believing they had finally escaped its sinister grasp. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. Emily tried to forget about the cabin and the terrifying night they'd spent there. But one evening, as she was preparing for bed, she caught a glimpse of something in her mirror. A shadowy figure standing just behind her, with hollow eyes staring into hers. Her phone buzzed, and when she glanced at it, she saw a single message from an unknown number. "You will never leave." Emily screamed, but the figure was gone. She realized that no matter how far she went, the haunting presence from Blackwood Cabin had followed her, and it wasn't planning on letting her go. I'd heard the rumors about Redwood High for years, an abandoned school on the edge of town. It was a place wrapped in mystery, where legends of hauntings spread like wildfire among the teenagers in our town. Everyone seemed to have a story about strange sounds, ghostly apparitions, and whispering shadows. And like any teenager seeking a thrill, I decided I'd see it for myself. It was one of those cold autumn nights, the kind where the air felt still, almost watching. My friends, Jamie, Lila, and Ben, joined me. They were the brave, maybe foolish kind who would do anything for a story. Redwood High was nestled in an overgrown field surrounded by twisted, barren trees. Its windows were shattered, walls scrawled with graffiti, and vines twisted up the sides like skeletal hands. But as we walked toward it, we felt something different, like the silence itself was alive, pressing in on us. The door groaned as we pushed it open, echoing down a darkened hallway. The flashlight beams bounced off dusty lockers and cracked tiles, illuminating faded posters that had long lost their vibrancy. It felt like time had stopped in Redwood High, frozen in a moment of abandonment. But it was the silence that unsettled us most, so complete it felt wrong, almost unnatural. Jamie broke the silence. "So, what are we looking for exactly?" I shrugged. "Proof, I guess, of whatever's supposed to be here." We moved deeper into the school, and soon we found the old gymnasium. The air was cold here, colder than it should have been. Our breath fogged, and an eerie sense of being watched made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. In the shadows at the edge of the gym, something seemed to move. We froze, staring at a row of bleachers. Then, we heard it. Faint, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of someone walking with heavy shoes on a wooden floor. But we were alone. "Weren't we?" Ben whispered. "Let's just go somewhere else." But Jamie shook his head, stubborn. "No way. We came here to see something. Let's check out the classrooms." Room by room, we wandered, moving deeper into Redwood High, the tapping following us down the hall. At one point, we reached a door with Room 205 painted on it. Unlike the others, it seemed untouched, the wood clean, the handle shining. "I don't remember this room," Lila muttered, her voice trembling. Inside, the desks were arranged neatly, as though the students had left in the middle of a lesson. Papers lay scattered on the floor, and in the dim light, we could make out a single sentence scrawled over and over on the chalkboard. "They are here." As we moved closer, I saw it, a shadow that stretched across the back wall, its shape unmistakably human yet wrong, somehow twisted and warped. It seemed to watch us, growing darker and more defined as we stared. And then, it moved. We froze, feeling the weight of its gaze on us. The shadow seemed to melt off the wall, pooling on the floor, then stretching toward us like an ink blot come to life. My body went cold with dread as the shadow stretched across the floor, reaching for us. We stumbled back, tripping over desks as we scrambled toward the door. The tapping returned, louder this time, faster. Someone, something, was walking toward us down the hall. We burst out of room 205, slamming the door behind us, but we could still hear the footsteps, and worse, the faintest of whispers. It sounded like children's voices, laughing softly, mockingly, echoing off the decaying walls. We ran, but the faster we went, the louder the footsteps grew, chasing us down the empty halls. Finally, we reached the main doors, shoving them open and stumbling into the cold night air. We didn't stop until we were far from Redwood High, panting, our hearts pounding. None of us spoke, too shaken to break the silence. Later, I tried looking up room 205, but as far as records went, Redwood High never had such a room. The school had been abandoned decades ago after a fire broke out, trapping students and teachers inside. Some of them had never been found, lost in the flames or something else. Now Redwood High stood empty, abandoned. But after that night, we knew it was anything but empty. There were shadows there, shadows that remembered, and now shadows that waited.